Yet the output of these acts was still far from mainstream, and like Sandy Hurwitz, these more traditional artists were making music that would perhaps not have emerged if they were operating through a major label. Tim Buckley had moved far from his folk roots, and his work on the Straight label included the seminal Star Sailor album, which added contributions from ex-Mother of Invention Bunk Gardner, while Jerry Yester's album with his wife Judy Henske confidently blended a wide mixture of styles totally out of keeping with the predominant sounds of the day.
Tim Buckley was a prodigy. I mean, his first album, I think from '66, it was a callow, romantic songs of, absolutely a teenager in love and in pain with love as well. But he developed very, very quickly after that. I mean, you started to hear this free, fluid, liquid jazz influence coming in. There was vibes. And his voice was like no other voice, I think, in the late 60s. It was an instrument. It really took off into places that no other male rock voice moved before.
I woke up hoping that you would still be there, knowing the song of the town was calling you from my dream.
So in that respect, it fitted with the sort of out-there-ness of Bizarre and Straight, definitely. Elektra and Jack Holtzman at Elektra was the first to sign him, and that was a good home for Buckley, I think, because they were an artist, well known as an artist label, and giving them their freedom. But I think Bizarre gave a lot more freedom, and I think Buckley really took that as well. You know, he's a very beautiful man with an incredible voice, and he looks like the perfect quintessential singer-songwriter in a way. But when you listen to some of those albums, Blue Afternoon and Star Sailor, and there's something absolutely astonishing going on there, which has nothing to do with your James Taylors and your other writers of that ilk from that period. He really was a musical adventurer in his own way, like Zappa or Beefheart.
I think the album that Judy Henske and Jerry Yester did for Straight Records, Farewell Aldebaran, I think that's the most outstanding product that was issued on those labels, with the exception of Zappa's own performances. They were both managed by Herb Cohen, and they'd come from a folk background primarily, although Jerry Yester had moved into folk rock, as had Judy Henske to some extent. I really do think that the opportunity to be on the label, although Frank Zappa did not have that much direct input into the record, gave them kind of license to be a little weirder and more creative than they had been at any time before that, and actually since then.
The end of the world is a windy place where the eagle builds her nest of lace.
Frank Zappa did have a very good direct influence on the record, which wouldn't be obvious from looking at the sleeve. Judy Henske had been a folk singer for quite a while and was starting to get more involved in her material as a writer. And Frank Zappa, around the time that they went on Straight Records, looked at some of Judy Henske's poems and said, "These are really good. You should be setting these to music. You should be making songs out of these." And she has told me in interviews that that was the best encouragement that she got as far as developing as a songwriter from Frank Zappa. And again, that's contrary to his public image. You might think, well, what would this guy really want with an ex-folkie, and why would he be especially interested in being a nice guy anyway? That's a different side of Frank Zappa that you don't see so much from his public statements and the biographies of Frank Zappa. I think he could be more generous in a non-sarcastic, non-ironic way than a lot of people realize.
Outside of Herb Cohen's roster, Straight did sign up one more act in 1969, the final addition to the label brought on board by Frank Zappa. Once again, this was a band that came to his attention purely by chance rather than talent he had actively sought out, and their music was far removed from the label's output so far. The Persuasions were an a cappella vocal group formed in New York in the early 60s, their music rooted in gospel but also incorporating more contemporary influences. Upon hearing them, Zappa, an artist steeped in the multifarious forms of black American music, needed little persuading to sign the band to his label.
We had a manager, his name was David Dasheff, and he was friends of Stan Krause, who Stan owned the record store in Jersey City. We went over to Stan's record store to rehearse because we were going to do a show for Stan at the State Theater. So we went over to Stan's record store to rehearse. And when we got there, Stan introduced us to David Dasheff, who at the time was a college grad from Harvard. And he heard us and he said, man, listen, I could manage you guys. He said, in fact, let me make a phone call to a friend of mine, and I want y'all to sing to him over the phone. Well, he made this phone call to this friend, and we started singing, I just can't work no longer. I got to see my woman right now. We ain't getting any younger. Got to get to her love somehow. And lo and behold, whoever was on the other end of that phone, but not knowing to us, we didn't know. You know, and when he hung up, he said, man, the guy on the other end was cracking up. He said, he loved you guys, man. He said, and if you don't know it, that was Frank Zappa. And I said, wow, Frank Zappa. But I was saying to myself, who the fuck is Frank Zappa? You know what I mean? I said, who is Frank Zappa? I mean, you're talking about a guy that grew up listening to Sam Cooke, you know, Jackie Wilson. You know, I'd never heard of Frank Zappa. But then, you know, God worked in mysterious ways. David came to us and said, man, Frank, love you guys. We got 6 airplane tickets to fly to Los Angeles, and we're going to record on Frank's label.
Well, yes.
Upon their arrival in Los Angeles, the band cut several tracks at Whitney Studios. Although Zappa himself was not present, touring commitments with the Mothers meaning that he would not meet the 5 members of his new signing until the following year. A combination of studio and live recordings, the Persuasions' debut album, A Cappella, was released in February 1970.
It was special because it was the start of something that we really didn't know anything about. It was the start of something very big. It was the start of the Persuasions' career.
The whole world is a stage, all right, and everybody's playing a part. Hold on, the stage is set, the curtain goes up, the scene is a broken heart.
If you look at all the projects of the straight bizarre period, it's almost like Zappa is painting you a picture of his influences. He's painting you a picture of the things that inspire him. And it's all there. And the Persuasions have to be there because it's harmony singing which derives from gospel, which informs black music in successive waves, but especially doo-wop. The first side is a live recording, and it has those elements that put a lot of people off Zappa, which is chaos and liveness. And it has an amazing version of Old Man River, which brings out, immediately pulls upon the whole Paul Robeson, Deep South suffering kind of strand, that history of oppression of black people.
Show me the way. Show me the way from the rich man's land. Show me that stream called the River of Jordan. That's the old stream that I long to.
So that's in there, as well as the ability of voices to enthrall a whole crowd with no backing. So it's a document, it's the whole idea that a document matters of the Persuasions live in concert. Then you flip the record over and it's extremely beautifully sung in studio tracks, and they begin with Drip Drop by Leiber Stoller, so there's rock and roll for you. Frank Zappa's knowledge and interest in black music is so deep that he could see that gospel is where a lot of it comes from, because gospel is the non-commercial area where people can get together, and this is true of the white side of gospel as well. They can rehearse and practice music, and all they're interested in is the effect of the people in that room. It's no longer about guessing record sales or any of that stuff, and it's where real musicality can be nurtured. So the Persuasions, to me, the Persuasions record is like him saying, this is the soul of my music, something which a lot of people deny to Frank they had any soul at all. Well, listen to the Persuasions and you'll hear the soul of Frank Zappa.
Yet no matter how much the Persuasions' music meant to Zappa personally, upon its release the record was yet another obscurity. While the Mother's own albums on the Bizarre label were finding good distribution through Warner's, the Straight albums were suffering from poorer deals and little promotion. Although the band would go on to much greater success later in the decade, the lack of sales and exposure for a cappella was a disappointment for the Persuasions.
I think distribution was maybe not what we wanted to be, but then again, it was something new. A cappella was something new to the business at that time. So I'm not too sure that I don't think the record company did the big time distribution, you know, but on the other hand, what it did for us, it introduced us to the world.
By the time that the album was released, Zappa's own situation had significantly altered, and he was no longer able to dedicate the time and energy to the Bizarre and Straight labels that he once had. Since the summer of 1969, his musical activities had taken a new direction. The recording of the jazz rock deviation Hot Rats saw him working on a solo release, and shortly afterwards he disbanded the Mothers of Invention. By 1970, he was forming a new ensemble, and this would leave him little time to develop new acts.
Frank had to spend more time on his own music, and now you also have to understand that at this point he had a lot of other things going on his plate at the time. By 1970, he's got a new band together, and he had to put a lot of time and effort into that, not to mention rehearsing, but touring. When he's out on the road with the Flo and Eddie Mothers, how was he able to sit there and produce Alice Cooper's second record or Captain Beefheart's second record? I mean, he just didn't have the time. Plus, Herb Cohen was bringing in a lot of stuff at this point as well, you know, and Frank had nothing to do with it, you know, and maybe he felt, well, Herb's taking care of it. Maybe he didn't come across any other artists that he felt at the time was worth producing. I don't know, but I think he overextended himself. He didn't realize how much work it's going to be. He started it. He knew it was in capable hands of Herb Cohen for the most part, and he let it ride.
This wasn't a problem for some of his existing acts. While the GTOs and Wildman Fisher would not record again for the label, Alice Cooper were developing independently of the Bizarre and Straight setup. After the initial boost in their profile from being associated with Zappa, by mid-69 they were actively looking to distance themselves from this connection.
Being under Frank's wing was a big boost for our career, but at a certain point it started to become a thorn in our side because we were hearing so many people that would automatically give credit for what we were doing to Frank, like we were just being puppets to whatever Frank wanted to do. And that wasn't true at all.
We were creating our own thing, Alice Cooper, which is what we all wanted to do. I really wanted to do. I didn't want to be under the wing of Frank. I appreciated what he was doing for us and will always be grateful for that. I mean, you know, he's the one person that said, there's something here. He's the first person on the planet that got it, that could really help us. So always be grateful for that. But the ideas that he had for the band when we get together for meetings, really what his vision was very different than ours.
Yet he was still on hand to offer the band advice. In September 1969, Alice Cooper had performed at the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival Festival on the same bill as Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, and headliner John Lennon. When frontman Cooper threw a live chicken into the crowd, headlines the next day reported that he had in fact bitten its head off and drunk its blood. Zappa phoned the band immediately and told them, "Whatever you do, don't tell anyone you didn't do it."